So let's continue this conversation on the kind of the beginnings of dominant minority relationships in the United States. Important concept that we have to think about is paternalistic relations, paternalism. In this case, the nature of intergroup relationships will reflect a society's subsistence technology. And a society with a small elite class and a plantation-based economy will often develop a form of minority relations that we refer to as paternalism, and this is definitely the case that we find in the United States. Some key features of paternalism: vast power differentials and huge inequalities between dominant and minority groups. This was the design of this society, and it is not surprising to see extreme inequality between the dominant group and the minority groups here in the United States. Now, we do see some assimilation, and some of the modern day dominant, or some of the modern day minority groups are making strides and being successful in the United States. But when we can compare the groups between the dominant and the minority groups, we find inequality. We also find an elaborate and repressive system of control over the minority group. Now, at this time, this was the case. We see it in relationship to slavery with with Africans coming to the country. We see it with genocide against Native Americans, and just extreme discrimination and prejudice against those groups that are trying to immigrate from their home to the United States and find themselves at the bottom. These are also represented by caste-like barriers between groups, meaning that historically there was no design for minority groups to be able to integrate with the dominant. We also find an elaborate and highly stylized codes of behavior and communications between groups. The way we justify and interact between the dominant and the minority groups, especially historically. And this all leads to, ironically, low rates of overt conflict. Doesn't mean that there's not conflict simmering underneath the surface, but the structure in and of itself of society is designed to tamp that conflict down. Paternalistic relationships in the United States slave society, it saw that slaves were defined as chattel and had no civil or political rights. You can imagine how a group that has no recourse to fight against what's happening to them might find it impossible to struggle against this oppressor. Of course, the master determined the type and severity of punishment. Slaves were forbidden by law to read or write. Marriages were not legally recognized, and masters separated families at will. You have to remember that slavery was a caste system, or a closed stratification system, which was strictly enforced through codes of etiquette, where slaves had to show deference and humility when interacting with whites. These unequal interactions allowed elites to maintain an attitude of benevolent despotism towards slaves, often expressed as positive emotions of affection for their black slaves. You can imagine, as you think into the future, as we will eventually get into the civil rights movement, where slavery had long been outlawed and abolished in the United States, but the demands of whites in U.S. society on African Americans and this continued master slave interaction, it just became overbearing for African Americans in the United States. And when we look into this, we'll find that the atrocities of the abolishing of slavery and the changes of civil rights in the United States lay at the hands of whites in the United States, not those of color. We have to remember that slavery was based on a contradiction. And that is that the master learned to treat his slaves both as property and as men and women. The slaves therefore learned to express and affirm their humanity even while they were constrained in much of their lives to accept their status as chattel. This creates a powerlessness of slaves and made it difficult for them to openly reject or resist the system. But with that being said, they weren't all passive. Many were, but many revolted. Many ran away. Harriet Tubman's going to be replacing Andrew Jackson on the 20 here in the not too distant future. And Harriet Tubman is mostly known for her participation in the Underground Railroad, where they were helping slaves who fled their masters to escape to the north. They also used forms of resistance most readily available to them, or things like sabotage, or just intentional carelessness, dragging their feet, work slowdowns. When somebody's making you work, you will do everything you can eventually to slow the process down, to resist even in the slightest bit where you could. As the institution of slavery develops throughout our history, a distinct African American experience accumulated and traditions of resistance and accommodation developed side by side. This African American culture was forged in response to the realities of slavery, and was manifested in folklore, music, religion, family, kinship structures, and other aspects of everyday life that continue to resonate in African American families today. So, some things we need to think about are the dimensions of minority group status. Remember those three concepts: ethnocentrism, competition, and differentials in power. Well, they ultimately lead to inequality and institutionalized discrimination, which feeds into prejudice and racism, which of course feeds back into this inequality and institutionalized discrimination. The plantation elite used its greater power resources to consign blacks to an inferior status. Ultimately, the system of racial inequality was implemented and reinforced by institutionalized discrimination and became a central aspect of everyday life in the antebellum South. Most scholars agree that individual prejudices and ideological racism are not important as causes for the creation of a minority group status, but are more the result of systems of racial inequality. Anti-black prejudice and racism began as part of an attempt to control the labor of black indentured servants and became embedded in every in early American culture, sorry. And ultimately were established as integral parts of the socialization process of succeeding generations. So you establish the new behaviors, and then you socialize them over time. Some key concepts for understanding the creation of slavery: of course, power, inequality, institutional discrimination. The legal and political institutions of colonial society were shaped to benefit the landowners and give them almost total control over the slaves. You can begin to understand why it was so hard to overthrow slavery first, Jim Crow second, and then why it was necessary to institutionalize civil rights so we didn't fall back into these patterns. Prejudice and racism helped to mobilize support for the creation of minority group status and to stabilize the systems as they emerge. Ultimately, once created, dominant group prejudice and racism become widespread. And they've also become common ways of thinking about the minority group. And they're difficult to move past. In terms of assimilation, well, the apologists argue that British American slavery operated as a school for civilization. Sounds so nice that way, doesn't it? A school for civilization. Sounds much worse when you say enslaving a population and brutally oppressing them. Of course, at the opposite extreme, slavery has been likened to a perverted patriarchy that brainwashed, emasculated, and dehumanized slaves, stripping them of their heritage and culture. That sounds a little more like it. And then the third view of the impact of slavery maintains that through all the horror and abuse of enslavement, slaves retained a sense of self and a firm anchor in their African traditions that stresses the importance of kinship, religion, and culture in helping African Americans cope. Another thing we need to think about is gender relations. So in terms of gender relations, the constraints were triple for black female slaves. Much like Patricia Hill Collins, the triple threat of oppression: black in a white society, slave in a free society, women in a society ruled by men. Besides domestic chores, female slaves also worked in the fields. Sounds kind of similar to what females get today. Domestic chores and you still got to work. Women slaves were sometimes used to breed more slaves, in addition to being raped and abused by the dominant group males. Women were often more worked in sex-segregated groups, which gave female slaves an opportunity to develop same-sex bonds and relationships. And these networks and interpersonal bonds could be used to resist the system. One example of this would be induced abortions. Minority status also has to be thought of in reference to Native Americans in the United States. American Indian societies were highly variable in culture, language, size, and subsistence technology. We know in 1763 the British Crown ruled that the various tribes were to be considered sovereign nations with inalienable rights to their land. In other words, each tribe was to be treated as a nation state and had to be compensated for any loss of land. This seems like we're treating them as equals. In 1607, anywhere from 1 to 10 million American Indians were found in close proximity to the colonies. In 1890, the number had fallen to about 250,000 due to more diseases and the destruction of food supplies rather than to warfare. Ultimately, the result of the contact situation, American Indians were nearly approached to genocide.